Segment 29A, Introduction. This lecture begins in a state of malaise, which can be defined as a vague sense of physical, mental, or moral ill health. The United States' effort to prop up its South Vietnamese client state was hideously expensive in both resources and human lives. In the end, it achieved nothing. It was the United States' first experience with flat-out losing a war. The U.S., however, would emerge from this sad state. The Soviet Union would not. Segment 29B, The Age of Malaise, traces America's disastrous escalation of the Vietnam War. The first war covered on television network news, the Vietnam War also spawned an anti-war movement which fought the U.S. government every step of the way. President Nixon eventually ended the Vietnam War through Vietnamization, which supposedly handed the conduct of the war over to South Vietnam. In fact, South Vietnam was left to its inevitable fate. The sense of malaise brought on by losing Vietnam was amplified by other developments: Watergate, the oil crisis, and the Iran hostage crisis. Meanwhile, the Soviets celebrated the end of the 1970s with an equally idiotic decision to invade Afghanistan. In segment 29C, After the Cold War, we examine America's post-Cold War foreign activities, with particular emphasis on the Middle East. The U.S. spent most of the 1980s watching its most hated enemy, the Shiite regime in Iran, fight to a bloody stalemate with the equally loathsome Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein, a Sunni Muslim. When the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union eased into its death spiral, Americans started celebrating the demise of the Cold War. They spoke of a peace dividend to be found in the money which had previously been spent in the arms race. But in 1990, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait put an end to such talk. Led by U.S. President George H.W. Bush, the West and its Arab allies quickly retook Kuwait and at least apparently neutralized Iraq. The U.S.'s later interventions in Somalia, Bosnia, and Kosovo were not, sorry to say, anywhere near as successful as Operation Desert Storm. Segment 29D, In the Wake of September 11th, briefly examines American and Russian experiences with organized terrorism. Just as Americans were murdered on American soil by al-Qaeda terrorists on September 11, 2001, so Chechen terrorists have murdered innocent Russians upon Russian soil. The similarities between the two situations are instructive, as are the differences. And then for the stunning conclusion, setting aside the causes, real and alleged, of the American war in Iraq. That was 6 years ago that this whole thing started. We're nowhere near close enough to make any guesses yet. So we'll pass to the main question addressed in this course. Should the United States create a Pax Americana, or should it not? Segment 29B, The Age of Malaise. Like Truman and Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy believed in the domino theory. He considered the U.S.-supported client regime in South Vietnam a domino worth fighting for. He did not send mass U.S. combat troops to South Vietnam, but he did depose the South Vietnamese president Diem. Diem was indeed corrupt, but none of Diem's successors did much better. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, bears the true responsibility for escalating the Vietnam War. According to Johnson, North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the U.S. Navy in international waters on August 5, 1964. Johnson requested and obtained from Congress wide powers to wage war against North Vietnam. In hindsight, it looks that Johnson managed the so-called Tonkin Gulf incident to get a free hand to fight communism, a worthy end which Johnson pursued, I believe, by false means. In March 1965, the U.S. unleashed its first massive bombing campaign, Operation Rolling Thunder, but air power could not crush North Vietnamese morale. The first American combat units arrived in Vietnam that same month. By 1968, more than 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam, many of them draftees. Unlike the South Koreans, who fought hard for their country, the South Vietnamese were far less willing to die for their corrupt regime. But despite the Americans' numerical and technological advantages, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese could not be beaten by traditional means. They were fighting as guerrillas on their home territory. The Viet Cong could strike and fade back into the jungle, while the U.S. forces holed up in their armed camps. Despite the extravagant promises of some American generals, the United States was in fact stuck with a war it could neither win nor get out of. Most of America's wars had faced some opposition. New Englanders had resisted the War of 1812. The Copperheads were Northerners who wanted Lincoln to leave the Confederacy alone. The America First movement fought FDR's attempts to prepare America for World War II. But the anti-Vietnam War movement was the first in American history to become stronger as the war went on. For the first time, American TV watchers could see the war on network news. The only other major domestic news was the often violent anti-war protests happening around the nation. Eventually, the increasing human and financial costs of war forced President Johnson not to run for re-election in 1968. Eisenhower's former vice president, Richard Milhous Nixon, was elected president, pledging to end the Vietnam War with honor. But instead, Nixon dragged the war out by quote-unquote Vietnamization. In Vietnamization, the United States would not retreat, but supposedly gradually build the South Vietnamese army up until the South Vietnamese could bear the burden of the fighting. Even so, in 1970, Nixon extended the war into Cambodia and Laos, hoping to destroy Viet Cong staging camps. The result, however, was two more countries dragged into chaos. The 1973 Paris ceasefire agreement between the U.S. and North Vietnam brought about Nixon's cherished peace with honor. Freed of the burden of Vietnam, Nixon could pursue a more friendly, more realistic relationship with Red China. In return for granting the People's Republic of China de facto recognition, that is, everything but legal recognition, Nixon gained a counterweight against the Soviets. In January 1975, U.S. aid to South Vietnam ended. I should point out that both the Soviets and Red Chinese continued their aid to North Vietnam. On April 30, 1975, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese. 58,000 Americans had given their lives. Hundreds of thousands of Americans were wounded, fighting for a government which could not, in the end, run fight to save itself. The evacuation of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, complete with helicopters and gunfights, was the ultimate symbol. For the first time ever, the United States had fought a war and lost. The failure in Vietnam was but the largest of several setbacks in the 1970s. United States support of Israel led to an Arab oil embargo in 1973, which sent the world economy into spiraling inflation which lasted for years. The Watergate scandal brought down first Vice President Agnew and then, in August 1974, President Nixon himself. Nixon's immediate successors Gerald R. Ford and Jimmy Carter, were decent men who maintained the status quo more than they actually led. In the last year of Carter's presidency, America suffered the deep humiliation of the Iran hostage crisis. The Shah of Iran was a despotic dictator, but he was also America's anti-communist ally. He was deposed by a Shiite Muslim regime in 1979. When the former Shah was allowed to receive medical treatment in the U.S., the new Iranian regime stormed the American embassy in Tehran. They took the inhabitants hostage and kept them until 1981. Carter had better luck working for world peace. He managed to broker a peace treaty between Israel and modern Egypt. He also caused the Panama Canal Zone to be returned to the Panamanians. But Carter could not make a dent in what he rightly termed America's malaise. If anything, his well-meaning but often inept policies contributed to the malaise. Not that the USSR was riding a hot streak either. The Soviet people had long since gotten tired of paying for their nation's costly military buildup. Living in cramped, shabby apartments, working at dreary jobs, standing in long lines for scarce and scanty consumer goods. They had come to see communism as a bad joke. Nor did Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev have any new ideas for combating the Soviet malaise. Lost in his senile alcoholic fog, he did as his sycophantic advisors told him to do. One such bright idea was the invasion of Afghanistan on Christmas Day, 1979. One would have assumed that someone in the Soviet hierarchy would have learned the necessary lessons from the American fiasco in Vietnam. But what Brezhnev wanted, apparently a successful little war, was what the Soviet Union got. Soon, the USSR was up to its neck in a bloody, expensive guerrilla war which it could neither win nor get out of. The United States pulled itself out of its malaise with the same hard work and positive attitude we had shown in riding out the Great Depression. But the Afghan war would be the powder keg which blew the rotten Soviet state sky high. Segment 29C, After the Cold War. Striking directly at Iran was unlikely given the logistics. It was also imprudent for America to do so, given the state of the hostage crisis. Quite understandably, America was looking at ways to strike back at the Shiite Iranian regime. A promising proxy for the United States was just across the border in Iraq, the new strongman of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Himself raised a Sunni Muslim, Saddam kept Iraq's Shiite majority in line, despite the Shiite majority's natural sympathy for the Shiite regime in Iran. On September 22, 1980, Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. Whether or not President Carter had promised Saddam a free hand, he was happy to see the hated Iranians take one across the chops. Succeeding Carter in 1981, President Ronald Reagan made a priority of projecting American strength. Congress forbade him from dealing directly with Iraq, so he found ways of getting Saddam his weapons anyway. The war raged back and forth for nearly 8 bloody years. Isolated from both the United States and the godless communists, Iran ultimately sued for peace in August 1988. At first glance, it was a win-win situation for the United States. Two Middle Eastern heavyweights had pounded each other silly at no cost to the Americans. But that which looks too good to be true usually is. At the same time, Mikhail Gorbachev was allowing the Soviet Union's network of client states to go in peace. Apparently, the containment strategy was working. It looked like everything was going right. The Cold War's end would bring with it a peace dividend, which would take the place of Cold War military expenditures. Saddam Hussein had other tricks up his sleeve. Iraq had traditionally regarded the tiny but oil-rich emirate of Kuwait as really Iraqi territory. Saddam thought that war against a defenseless enemy would restore his damaged prestige at home and abroad. On August 2nd, 1990, Iraqi forces attacked and quickly overran Kuwait. 5 years earlier, the Western Bloc would have sided with Kuwait, forcing the Soviets to side with Iraq. Weirder things have happened. But while Gorbachev was taking congratulations for his Nobel Peace Prize, President George Herbert Walker Bush, a veteran of the Second World War, was planning to retake Kuwait. Saudi Arabia, a valued United States ally, was in danger, and so was its oil. While the United Nations engaged in ultimately fruitless negotiations, President Bush very quietly built up a huge Allied strike force in Saudi Arabia under the name Desert Shield. Once the UN's January 15th deadline failed, the Desert Shield turned into a desert storm. Allied forces began bombing Iraq on January 16, 1991. On February 23rd, the land offensive began. Even the elite Iraqi forces preferred surrender to combat. Kuwait was freed in 3 days. Although deposing Saddam Hussein was a definite option, President Bush held back, fearing that deposing Saddam would be destabilizing to the Middle East, especially giving Iran too free of a hand. Indeed, the Shiite regime in Iran would like nothing better than a Saddamless Iraq dominated by its Shiite majority. Even Israel, which hated Saddam Hussein even more than the Americans did, recognized the wisdom of President Bush's decision. America, as the sole remaining superpower, had shown itself willing to work with the international community in the form of the United Nations. There was no illusion about who had led the Allied coalition against Iraq. But it speaks tremendously about President Bush's leadership that this coalition worked so well. President Bush's luck did not work so well in Somalia. In 1992, President Bush sent U.S. troops to Somalia primarily to make sure the starving people got food. But when Bill Clinton became president in 1993, this humanitarian mission had exploded into a nasty little proxy war. During an October 3, 1993 raid on the Somali capital of Mogadishu, 2 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters were shot down and 3 damaged. The raiding party was rescued the next day, but the Somali warlords obviously won. They had received help, as it was later discovered, from a group led by a certain Osama bin Laden, last seen recruiting mujahideen to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. Not wanting another Vietnam, President Clinton withdrew U.S. forces. This was a prudent decision, but unfortunately it encouraged bin Laden to keep attacking U.S. interests. A pariah throughout the West, and in most Arab nations too, bin Laden wound up setting up his shop in Afghanistan with a fundamentalist Taliban regime which had kicked out the Soviets. From there, bin Laden and his terrorist group, which came to be known as Al-Qaeda, lashed out against countries, both Western and Arab, which offended bin Laden's ideas about world rule. Fear of another Vietnam also affected the West's response to the former nation of Yugoslavia. Created in 1919 as part of the Versailles Treaty, Yugoslavia had been made up of various smaller nationalities, such as the Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Bosnians, and of various faiths, including Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Islam. An ineffective monarchy before the Second World War, Yugoslavia emerged as a strong and semi-independent communist state led by Marshal Joseph Tito. But once the Soviet client state network had crumbled, each of the Yugoslavian peoples wanted to go its own way. However, the different nationalities and different faiths had long since been hopelessly entangled with each other. The region of Bosnia was a prime example. Settled by Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats, and Bosnian Muslims, the natives of Bosnia had been at each other's throats literally for centuries. When the Serbs got the upper hand and began ethnic cleansing of Bosnians and Croats, Clinton decided to intervene. For most of September 1995, NATO forces bombed the Bosnian Serb army, effectively forcing them to the negotiating table. The Dayton Accords of December 1995 brought some peace to Bosnia, but the problem of ethnic cleansing just moved south. In 1999, NATO found itself again bombing Serbs, this time for practicing ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. Russia lent moral support to their old Serbian buddies, but they were by now too weak even to hint at threatening NATO. It's got to be noted, though, that the Kosovars were no nicer to the Serbs once they got the upper hand. And to this day, Kosovo is still ruled by a transitional UN government. It's also worth noting that the Russians are starting to feel once more the stirrings of empire. Segment 29D, in the wake of September 11th. As Boris Yeltsin led Russia into its post-Soviet future, one major priority was to set up relationships with all former Soviet republics and regions. The only former part of the USSR unwilling to deal with the Russian Federation was tiny Chechnya, deep in the Caucasus Mountains. The Chechens had despised Russians since Alexander I conquered the Caucasus in the early 19th century. Since then, the Chechens had endured hardships from the Russians and Soviets alike, including mass deportations as recently as during the Second World War. In 1993, Chechnya declared its complete independence, prompting the First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996. The beaten up and underpaid ex-Soviet army was no real match for the Chechen guerrillas. President Boris Yeltsin signed a ceasefire with independent Chechnya rather than sink his nation into yet another Afghanistan crisis. Not bad for an old drunk. Yet on October 1st, 1999, then Prime Minister Vladimir Putin invaded Chechnya, touching off the Second Chechen War, which continues to this time. I should state from the very beginning that both the Russians and the Chechens are equally guilty of terrorist action. The Russians have bombed the Chechen capital of Grozny literally into rubble. A Russian puppet government hassles native Chechens to this day. On the other hand, the Chechens have carried out numerous frightening terrorist actions, including the Moscow theater hostage crisis of October 2002 and the Beslan school siege of September 2004. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Muslim Chechens have been building ties to Islamic terrorist organizations in an attempt to hold out against Russia. On September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda terrorists at the direction of Osama bin Laden took nearly 3,000 American lives on American soil. How bin Laden was able to mastermind this treacherous attack still remains open to question. To me, it's counterproductive even to ask, especially when the United States is pressed after all this time with so many other related issues. President George W. Bush publicly vowed to bring to justice the criminals, especially Osama bin Laden, who committed this atrocity on American soil. The Taliban regime of Afghanistan, which had housed Osama bin Laden, was a logical first place to start. But waging a war in this part of the world, Central Asia, on such short notice would take unusual cooperation from Afghanistan's neighbors. Surprisingly, President Vladimir Putin of Russia pledged the United States his full assistance in what he called the war on terrorism. Bases in the former Soviet republics of Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan were brokered by Putin also. They were crucial to American success in the war against Afghanistan's Taliban. The Taliban was knocked out of power, if not destroyed entirely, depriving al-Qaeda of its most effective base. At this point, the United States took the puzzling step of moving against Iraq. Unlike his father, who had quickly put together an anti-Iraq coalition in 1990, George W. Bush, the 43rd president, had more trouble finding world support for his belief that Saddam Hussein used weapons of mass destruction and would use them in the future. Eventually, the United States and Britain, with a group of troops from other countries, invaded Iraq on March 20, 2003, and quickly brought down the government of Saddam Hussein. On March 1, 2003, George W. Bush declared the end of quote-unquote major combat operations. At the time I'm speaking these words, 4 years after the fact, the United States and British military are still extensively deployed in Iraq, supporting a fledgling democratic government. The rightness or wrongness of this military operation will take years to establish. At present, it is basically a matter of opinion. There's no earthly way of knowing how this will all turn out. So instead, let's turn to a question that you hopefully should be able to deal with. What are the proper goals of America and its foreign policy after 9/11/2001? More than 2 centuries ago, President George Washington cautioned America to avoid foreign entanglements. Yet, the lesson of 2 world wars has taught us that America cannot just stick its head in the sand while the rest of the world slugs it out. There's no doubt that the United States is the most powerful financial and military country on the planet. The United States has also demonstrated that it can and will act alone or with a small number of close allies to preserve what it sees as American interests. Should the United States maintain a Pax America, or should it not? Over the course of the semester, we have watched the Romans guarantee peace throughout the Mediterranean world through their Pax Romana. The Russians, too, guaranteed European peace through the post-Napoleonic Pax Russica of the early 1800s. There is plenty of evidence that Russia, now flushed with oil wealth, is once again throwing its power around in its former East European sphere of influence. The Russians claim, of course, that they're looking out for their nation's best interests and for the cause of world peace. But are they really? Is America looking out for our nation's best interests and the cause of world peace? Should we be? Why? Why not? Explain. Thank you. Segment 29E, Conclusions. Why we fight. America's wars have invariably met with some opposition on the home front. Conversely, American presidents have given some controversial reasons for going to war. We've already seen how Lyndon B. Johnson manipulated the 1964 Tonkin Gulf incident to justify escalating the Vietnam War. George H.W. Bush successfully received a mandate from the Senate to pursue the Gulf War in 1990, but it was pretty close. Even after the Gulf War's successful conclusion, Bush was accused of fighting for oil, as his son George W. Bush would be accused of doing more than a decade later. Bill Clinton's interventions in Bosnia and Kosovo were both done not in the name of the United States, but in the name of NATO, even though no NATO member was being threatened. It's just that the UN was not giving President Clinton the green light he wanted, so the next best thing was a green light from NATO. To this day, George W. Bush is still coming up with various ways of justifying his invasion of Iraq. Unfortunately, his double talk on this topic is an American presidential tradition participated in by presidents of both parties. 2. Do you remember your President Nixon? By the time I recall getting interested in politics, I was a junior high school kid, and the Watergate scandal was in full bloom. From the comments of Republicans and Democrats alike, it was obviously time for Richard Milhouse Nixon to resign or be impeached. It was clear to me that Nixon was, despite his protests, a crook. It was clear to me then that he was the worst president ever. 30 years later, I've come to believe that Nixon eroded considerably the presidency's prestige. He sure did. But I have also come to realize that Nixon's foreign policy, aside from the quote-unquote Vietnamization of the Vietnam War, made a lot of sense. It's amazing what you can learn as you grow older and examine things critically. Nixon's decision to establish relations with Red China was an important step toward ending the Cold War. The Chinese were grateful for being recognized as a world power. The Soviets were frightened by China's enhanced status. Had a Democratic president tried such a bold move, congressional Republicans would likely have torpedoed it. But when the extremely conservative Republican Richard Nixon came up with the idea, he was able to make it work, and that was a good thing. 3. One man's terrorist. This semester we have seen literally 2 millennia of terrorism. In 88 BC, King Mithridates of Pontus had 40,000 Romans killed in his attempt to kick the Romans out of Asia Minor. In 1565, Ivan the Terrible of Russia formed his Oprichnina, a secret police designed to scare and murder Russia's upper classes into submission. The colonial Sons of Liberty came up with all sorts of tricks to drive out British troops and make British sympathizers feel unwelcome. Invariably, the terrorists and the victims claim their total innocence, but there is very seldom enough innocence to go around. Today, the charge of terrorism is thrown around like a football or a frisbee. Sadly, there is usually at least a little validity to these charges. Nothing could justify Al-Qaeda's murders of innocent Americans on September 11, 2001. Nothing could justify the Chechens' murder of innocent Russians in Beslan, the school children. And thousands of innocent Iraqis have been killed while the United States has pursued its foreign policy in Iraq. It's no stretch to believe that the Osama bin Ladens and Adolf Hitlers of this world are totally evil. They are, no doubt about it. But nobody, America included, is totally pure either. Far from it. And finally, 4, say what you think. And this has to do with writing your essays. When I was teaching this class a couple summers ago, I had a couple of Russian brothers in my class, emigres literally from St. Petersburg, Russia. Vasily was a little guy, friendly and chatty. Arseny was friendly, but he was very big and he didn't say very much. He was very burly, did I mention that? One day as I was running my mouth about the U.S. intervention in Bosnia and Kosovo, Arseny raised his big, huge, burly hand and asked politely to speak. Then he stood up and delivered a long rant about how the United States had no business doing anything in Eastern Europe, period. And this is coming from a Russian who moved to the United States. It wasn't as if he hated America. He loves living in America. It's just that he was being a Russian, giving a traditional Russian view on the subject. I was very grateful to him for speaking up, because international viewpoints just don't march into my classroom every day of the week. I was also grateful for the fact that he was very polite about the way he voiced his strong opposition to American policy. I encourage you to seek opposing opinions. Whether you find them from international students here, on the internets, and wherever else you can get them, it's all good. And as always, say what you think, but say it politely. I hope that I've said this all politely too. Thank you for putting up with it. Beep.